Hello again. Last session, we discussed that all behaviors has meaning. Understanding trauma triggers is an important part of understanding the meaning behind survivors' behavior. At this point of the module, we will talk about triggers. Most of us have heard of trauma triggers before. Perhaps some of you understands it as a cue, a stimulation, or a prompt. Triggers refers to false alarms. When we hear, see, or feel something that reminds us of scary things that have happened in the past. Triggers are things that causes a response based not on reality, but on a memory of danger that we have experienced in the past. That past memory induces a response as if we are facing the danger all over again, even if we're not. Now let's try to learn through an experience. We learn through experience. We all learn through experience. Everything that we know and believe is learned this way. Let's have this example. Imagine you're walking through the park when you see a big snake on the path near your feet. How would you react? Perhaps some of you will jump, some of you will scream, or others will run. Some of us may freeze and may not be able to move, right? Now, think about walking through that same park a week later. Do you think you would do anything differently? How might you feel about walking again on that path, on that park? And what if you look ahead and saw a stick on the path? Do you think you might be startled a bit initially? Perhaps you've walked through that park hundreds of times before. But now that you've seen a snake, you're more alert of the danger while walking through. You'll be more vigilant. You'll be more alert. This is because of how our brains are wired with an alarm system that keep us safe. Sometimes, trauma triggers and phobias can be confused. We've outlined the definition of the trauma here, trauma triggers. These are direct result of trauma experiences or a traumatic experience. That is a trauma trigger. Phobias are actually anxiety disorders that create a persistent fear of an object or situation which leads a person to avoid that specific object or to avoid that specific certain situation. While the brain often responds to triggers and phobias the same way, the big difference is that phobias aren't always tied with a traumatic experience. Sometimes they simply develop in a person who hasn't necessarily had a negative experience with that specific object or situation. Trauma is rooted in an experience which is characterized by powerlessness. Someone with a phobia may be afraid of a situation, but generally has the capacity to avoid it or to take action in the circumstance. Like, for example, some of us would run, hide, jump, or scream. The essence of trauma is that a person has experienced a harmful, dangerous, or frightful event in which they were powerless to respond or to take action. They could not run, they could not flee, they could not scream. Despite experiencing harm, which in turn produces damaging effects on the brain. This powerlessness in the face of danger is something that's unnatural for our brain and for our body. And the reason for the more significant effects of trauma on the whole person as opposed to phobia's more singular effect on fearfulness or anxiety. Although it is possible for phobia to develop out of traumatic experience, that is possible, trauma cannot develop out of a phobia. For example, someone who is robbed in the street by an armed man may experience a flashback of being robbed or become suddenly paralyzed. Okay? We will talk shortly about how to help a survivor identify her triggers or his triggers. But first, let's identify some universal triggers. First, loss of control. Loss of control. This is when we feel that we don't have control over our bodies or thoughts or control over our emotions. Feeling out of control is a common trigger for survivors of trauma. That's why some victims of sexual abuse, we try to lessen as much as possible the touch whenever we do certain laboratories. Okay. Next is power differential. This is when we sense that someone is taking advantage of their authority. Many trauma survivors respond aggressively or have difficulty engaging with individuals who seem to lord their authority over them. Third and last universal trigger is lack of predictability. This is when we don't know what is going to happen next. This can cause fear and a sense of loss of control for survivors. That's why it's important to give them, to inform them what are their certainties and what are the uncertainties, especially if you will place them in a shelter. How long are they going to stay there? Who will be their companions there? Are they allowed to be visited? This is very important because at times it can be a trigger. That's why they came in a shelter very nice, and then after quite some time, you will see their behaviors changing. Okay, because it can be a trigger, that lack of predictability. There are three essential components in supporting survivors in managing triggers. Okay, first, identify triggers. Second, identify early warning signs. Third, early identifying strategies. In the succeeding slides, we will break these three components down. Okay, let's go first with the first. Identifying triggers. A trigger, again, is something that sets off an action. It sets a process or series of events, such as fear, panic, upset, or agitation. Okay? Triggers can be any number of things. Again, these triggers are individual specific. Take note of that. Triggers are individual specific. One person's trigger is not going to be another person's trigger. Triggers are also referred to as a threat cues, such as going to bed, room checks, large men, big men, yelling, or people too close, or even the smell of a perfume. Okay? It can be a cue of a threat. Survivors have unique histories with uniquely specific triggers. It is essential to ask and incorporate into plans to support them. You need to incorporate these in our treatment plans, in our way of living in the shelter, so that we can support them more. A good question is, what makes you feel scared or upset or angry or could cause you to go into crisis? Okay? So for example, not being listened to, lack of privacy, feeling lonely, darkness, being teased or picked on, feeling pressured, people yelling around him, particular time of day or night. For example, they are very sensitive uh, in the evening and very pleasant in the morning. Having arguments, being isolated, being touched, loud noises, not having control, being stared, room checks. This I think I mentioned this earlier, and contacted family. Okay. Next, we move to early warning signs, and remember, these are the behavioral cues that something is happening. A problem is brewing. Okay. An early warning sign is a signal of distress that is a physical precursor or a manifestation of upset. Typically, early warning signs are overt behaviors that we can see. It's observable behaviors such as restlessness, agitation, pacing, shortness of breath, sensation of tightness in the chest, masikip yung dibdib, or sweating, nagpapawis. However, these behaviors can be subtle and easily overlooked, especially if it is a low level of agitation, like pacing or foot tapping. Common yun, no, napapansin natin. Parang naglalakad-lakad lang. Sometimes, you cannot see the behavioral signs, okay? Like a sensation of tightness. We don't see that, we don't easily see na sumisikip na pala yung dibdib niya, yung paghinga niya, o hirap na pala siyang huminga. Unless somebody's got the understanding. Language and capacity to express the problem is also very important. As we learn in the trauma and the brain section, the Broca's area of the brain is impacted in times of crisis, and people don't always have access to language when they are in crisis. Language may not be readily available to a person where we are working, especially if they are upset. So we may not hear them say they are having trouble. Okay, and I think some of you would say, yeah, we have that kind of experience as well. We saw that in the shelter. We saw that with some of the survivors. They don't talk. They don't speak about their thoughts. They're not expressive. And yes, because it might be an early warning sign of something. Okay, a good question to ask to identify early warning signs for survivors is, what might you or others notice? Or what might you feel just before losing control? Okay? Ano bang napansin mo sa katawan mo bago ka nagwala, bago ka umiyak ng sobra-sobra? So, there are some answers, no? Or the survivors might identify the following: clenching teeth, wringing hands, bouncing legs, shaking, crying, giggling, heart pounding, singing inappropriately, pacing, eating more, breathing hard, shortness of breath, clenching of fist. These are common. Loud noise or loud voice, rocking, can't sit still, no? Hindi mapakali, very restless, swearing, or have you think of others? Marami yan, no? You can think of your own personal experience with your survivors. Early warning signs are not triggers themselves, okay? They are signs that a problem is brewing. Perhaps the survivor is about to be triggered. So napapansin nyo na siya na palakad-lakad, kumakanta, nagtatap ng feet. So it can be a sign of so you can approach that person now. Oh, napansin, I've noticed that you were tapping your feet. An early warning sign is a signal of distress that is a physical precursor and or a manifestation of an upset, as I've mentioned earlier. Typically, early warning signs are overt behaviors. No? Yan, yung pagiging balisa. Yan, nabanggit natin yan kanina. Okay. Lastly, we help survivors identify strategies for dealing with their triggers. Strategies are, again, individually specific mechanism, individually specific calming mechanism to manage and minimize that stress or distress, such as time away from a stressful situation or changing the environment. So if you think that the child is feeling distress or the survivor is feeling distress at that time, you can have her or him go to another room or another place, going for a walk, talking to someone who will listen. No? Again, this may not necessarily be a therapist or a psychologist or a social worker. Working out, lying down, listening to peaceful music. These are some examples. So a good question to ask to get at strategies that will work for a particular survivor is, what are some things that help you calm down when you start to get upset? So, especially if you've seen that survivor calming down after a certain rage, no? So you can tell that I noticed that when you were shouting earlier, no, after quite some time, no, you calm down. So what might be helping you, no, when you are enraged and you calm down? What helped you? They might respond with any number of coping skills, such as I read a book, no, nagpalakad-lakad lang, no, coloring, no, for younger kids, and even adults, no. There were some who are enjoying doing coloring, hugging a stuffed animal, taking a shower, deep breathing, being left alone. But you have to be mindful of this. Don't just leave them on one spot. Make sure that that spot is a safe spot. That a spot where he or she cannot hurt himself or herself. Okay? Talking to peers, no, if he or she likes it. A therapeutic touch. No, but again, in the Philippine setting, we need to be very mindful of this because, and also remember that most survivors uh, were victims of physical and sexual abuse. So touch may be a trigger. So you only do this, no, with a caveat, with a disclaimer, and you have to talk to the survivor first. That I usually touch a person on their shoulders, or tap them on their back, so that they will know that you are like that. No? Or you ask for permission. No? Is it okay to touch your shoulder, just to help you calm down? No? Yon. Exercising, eating, writing a journal, taking a cold shower, listening to music, molding a clay, calling friends or family, no, sino yung mga close and significant people around them na ma-identify niya. Okay? So these are just more strategies, no, blanket wraps, using cold face cloth, no, especially if if the person is very anxious or may tightness. Deep breathing exercise, getting a hug. Again, this is a sort of a touch. So there's a physical contact. So we have to be very mindful to ask the child if it's okay for him or for her, you to hug him. Running cold water on hands, ripping paper, using ice, having your hand held, again, no, with physical touch, snapping bubble wraps. I think we have lots of bubble wraps with our parcels, no? So pwede natin gamitin yung mga yon. Bouncing ball in quiet room. No? They can dribble a ball, or using a gym. No, they can go to gym and to exercise. Okay? These are even more strategies. No? A male staff support for a male survivor, a female staff support for a female staff survivor, or having a body-body system. Meron siyang kasamahan na co-resident who have perhaps the same experience, no? Tulad niya. Screaming into a pillow, crying, spiritual practices like, for example, praying, meditation, religious reflection, if the child is a spiritual person. Touching preferences, again, sabi ko nga, no, you have to be very careful with this. Speaking with a therapist, so if you approach the survivor and he told you that he doesn't want to talk to you, try to offer options. Do you want to talk to another staff? I can help you approach a social worker, a psychologist, so that he or she can be helped. Okay? Being read a story, using sensory room, using comfort room, again, dapat may bantay, syempre, no? And other stuff. Okay? So we can further assist in strategizing how to help a survivor when she is agitated by remembering to halt. Have you ever gotten cranky just because you were hungry, thirsty? Maybe because you were tired or having a bad day? It's the same thing with survivors. Okay, remember, no? Halt, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. Of course, if a person is have not eaten yet his breakfast, what do you expect to his mood? If he just went to a very tiring activity, diba? And then you're going to approach that person or the survivor, what would you expect? Of course, a very low energy as well. Diba? So you have to ask this. So are you hungry? Are you angry? Are you lonely? Are you tired? No, don't go to a conclusion that the person is mad at you, no, or the person is experiencing other things. No. HALT is an acronym we can use to remember to ask if a person is hungry, angry, lonely, tired, or thirsty. This is a way for service providers to learn to offer comfort rather than control when a survivor is escalating. Let's avoid asking immediately about the incident. Okay, let's avoid that. Telling to the person na, oh, you tell me what happened. Or you tell me, ano ba nangyari? Sino bang may kasalanan? Before you ask that, ask for these things. No? If he or she punched a person, No? So you ask, were you hurt? No? Kasi ayaw nating masaktan din siya. No? So let's try to look at other perspective, no, when dealing with this, with our survivors. So equally important to asking about what works, no, what strategies works, what effective strategies work to calm down is to ask specifically about what doesn't help when the survivor is upset. Okay? We all have preferences about how we like to be treated or what helps us calm down when we get upset. Asking survivors about specifically about this can again help us to understand how to best support them in a way that supports recovery and avoids re-traumatization. For example, the survivor might say that what does not help is being alone, not being listened to, being told to stay in my room, no, loud tone of voice, peers teasing, using humor, being ignored, having many people around me, no, which may make them feel overwhelmed, having space invaded, or a staff not talking to them seriously, belittling their feelings, belittling their experience. No? Okay lang yan, ganito lang yan. No? So to share you this quotation, no, by Natasha, an 18-year-old survivor. If I'm told in a mean way that I can't do something, I lose it. So we need to be very mindful and very sensitive. And trauma-informed care helps us to give that lens, that trauma lens. Okay, so that we can identify what's effective and what's not effective for our survivors. Okay? In addition to these three strategies for helping survivors manage triggers, we often need to help them understand to read their own emotions as well. We can do this by asking some simple questions and exploring their responses. So for example, what makes you feel upset? Or ano ba ang nagpapasama ng iyong kalooban o iyong loob? How do I know that I'm angry, scared, or upset? Asking these questions and using pictures, just as what presented on the slide, can help survivors have more personal insight into their own reactions, which is a huge step in managing triggers, especially with younger children. No? It's helpful to have visuals, yung mga pictures of emotions. Usually, you have emoticons to help them identify emotions. Okay? So these are other examples. No? You can help ask them to circle the picture. Okay? So, in summary, one means of understanding trauma triggers of survivor is to ask them. A few easy questions we can ask survivors are, what reminds you of bad, scary, fearful things? What do you look like when you're upset? Help me understand how someone might know if you were sad, angry, or scared. What helps you calm down when you're upset? So that you'll be able to identify whenever that particular survivor is having that trigger already. Okay? Once we have the answers to put these questions, we are already better equipped to understand what might trigger a survivor, how the survivor looks when she's getting upset, how to help calm a survivor down when she's feeling upset, and how to help her cope with the situation in the future. Okay, we're better poised to understand the behavior in light of its adaptive functioning of the survivor for the survivor. So it's not because that the survivor is talking to you with a very high tone. You will also talk to her or to him with such tone of voice. Okay, because it will not work. So remember, no, that you are on a better perspective whenever you are with the survivor. Okay, so let's have this case analysis. Okay, so let me just read the case. Mary, a 14-year-old female, is a survivor of sexual abuse by her mother's boyfriend. She is a new client in a shelter. She constantly fights with the service provider when she is told to take a shower. She has a poor personal hygiene. She would go for days without bathing if this was an option. On one occasion, she had an aggressive outburst when another client entered the room after she had finished showering. She began beating this other girl until the service provider intervened. Afterwards, she would not talk about what happened. The service provider responded to Mary by making her sit in the room by herself for 10 minutes after having her apologize to the other client. Afterwards, the service provider said she will lose movie right privileges, to which Mary responded with another outburst. Okay? So perhaps there are several Marys in our shelters or in your shelters. So what do you think might be going on here? Perhaps Mary is displaying aggressive behavior toward those people around her, service provider, a co-resident, or other children. What do you think of the way the service provider handled the situation? The service provider had justifiable reasons for removing privileges from Mary, right? However, the service provider should be intentional about debriefing with Mary on the incident in order to understand the reason of her aggressive behavior or reaction. So, we, the service provider here, just immediately reprimanded the the survivor without understanding what's happening. Okay? The third question, how would you handle this situation? What would your response be if you're the service provider? If I'm the service provider or if you are the service provider, wait until Mary calm down and to sit down and try to understand what may have caused or triggered Mary to be aggressive. No? So try to calm her down, to sit, let her sit, no, as long as instruct her that you are not allowed to hurt yourself, no, but you can sit down here. Also asking her why she doesn't like to take a bath or finding ways to solve her dislike for bathing. Okay? Okay. So again, we seek to change a question we service providers often ask. We ask, guys, take note of this, how do I understand this person? Versus, how do I understand this problem or symptom? Okay? The trauma-informed approach shifts the focus to the individual and away from some particular and limited aspect of his or her functioning. A holistic and trauma-focused understanding gives people a structure for organizing and understanding their experiences. Okay? So to sum it up here are the key points, key learning points in which we talk in this module. First, we learned that trauma triggers are false alarms. When we hear, see, or feel something that reminds us of scary things that have happened in the past, that's a trauma trigger. We can support survivors in managing triggers by helping them identify their triggers, identify early warning signs, and identify strategies for coping.